Again, time is of the essence, but we would like, in the interest of the panelists as well as the subject matter at hand, we'd like to get into a Q&A as soon as possible. The panelists have told me that no questions are off the table, but please keep in mind that His Excellency, the President of Russia, is just also in the city, so we do want to allow our Russian guests to travel back home safely. That said, I'm not going to introduce the panelists one by one, their bios are before, but just to say that we have among our midst a Russian student, a think tanker, a journalist, and a very prominent media person. So they can, between themselves, cover the full gamut of activity that is characterizing Russia's internet as we speak. And what I'm going to do is allow 4 to 5 minute very brief interventions from each speaker, starting from Viktoriia to my right and then onward, after which we will get into Q&A, and please start thinking of questions already. I have a few of my own. So Viktoriia, over to you.
Thank you. It's a really big honor to be here in India, in Delhi, at CyFy. I represent here an NGO in public diplomacy. I'm not an expert in digital sphere, but it is very important to point to that fact that in my everyday life, in my everyday job, I have to use social media networks and internet just, I think, 90% of time. And really now in Russia, it's a very important trend to use the whole range, the whole complex of technologies in your everyday life, in your job, and it gets more and more popular. I would like to pay your attention that really both Russian government and society think that development of Russia in its digital track is very important for the whole development. Also, there are a lot of skeptical voices about that, because you know that as it usually happens in big states and big countries, there is a big diversification or inequality between big cities to small rural areas. Just official statistics, for example, say that more than 90% of young people, like 95 or even 97%, have access to the internet, at least via smartphones, and really it is much more higher than, for example, in Europe. And it is a very important thing, because now in Russia, the whole educational system moves to this path of digitalizing. That is why in 2017, I think it was one of important main reasons why government accepted digital economy concept strategy to make all these processes go not in such a chaotic way, but to, I would say, add some order to that. Also, this movement, these trends, they are quite young, and anyway, especially I can see it, this technological development, these trends, they're really very useful in your everyday job. Even here, I was invited via Facebook, and I think that Russia will move that way more and more. And in my public diplomacy sphere, I cannot imagine life without information technologies and social media. I think that any connections could not exist. Also, I would like to make some, as I was answered about that before, how Russians use the internet. I would like to clarify how people in Russia perceive it. By the way, Facebook is not the most popular thing in Russia at all. I think that the recent statistics said something like 4 or 10 maximum % of Russians use Facebook, and it's more like LinkedIn platform. It's very often it is used for your job, for your self-representation, And it is popular among people, active people, politically active people, but the other part of Russia uses Russian social media networks. There are two of such networks, like Vkontakte, that is in connection, and Odnoklassniki, classmates. Although some people migrate to Facebook, I could say, but still such trends, I think they're connected both to more convenient surface, services and so on, and also some people do not trust, I could say, foreign social media networks, and all the story about private data also contributed to that. Well, I would like to focus to underline that fact that Russia really thinks that digital future should be taken into account by all the Russians, and we have special schools now, special strategies, but I think that my colleagues can contribute more to this topic, and I will be happy to clarify some other things, because it was like all in general. So,
thank you. I was just struck by the fact with 4% of connectivity to Facebook, Russia has been able to do amazing things with, especially with regard to elections in other countries. So I can only imagine what will happen if that number were to increase. But on a serious note, I do want to talk about the high number of folks who are on LinkedIn and what that means for Russians using, but I will get back to you on that, on what it means for Russia to use the internet to seek jobs. But for now, let me go to Tatiana.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a journalist. Now I'm a freelance journalist, and I'm used to work as a correspondent and a news anchor for one of the biggest Russian TV channels. So I would start that when we hear words Russia and web and Russia cybersecurity, I guess the two ideas just pop up in our minds for many of us. Like on the one hand, we have this kind of image of Russian hackers who are like gods, and the other hand, we have something about like digital economy in Russia. It's like a desert. It's like, you know, Arctic Russian desert with no signs of digital life at all. And that wouldn't be really fair. So, I mean, Russian hackers are recognized for their quality worldwide. But I would say that digital economy do exist in Russia. Speaking of numbers, it's like 2.8% from GDP. In comparison to, I don't know, Great Britain or United States, of course, it's not enough, because there you can find 10% of GDP, 12% of GDP, but we are growing. There are some companies we can be proud of, the big companies. I would mention Tinkoff Bank. Maybe you haven't heard of it, but actually this is the biggest bank in the world with no branches. So it's big in Russia, maybe around number 4 for crediting, and it is biggest in the world, and they have no branches at all. You can just go to that site, and tomorrow you can get a credit card, they just bring it to you. And over 60% of the employees work in the IT department. Of course, we have Kaspersky Lab, we have famous Yandex and Mail.ru Group. The last two are two biggest internet companies in Europe, if you don't count Google and Facebook, so it's pretty impressive too. We have some big companies and platforms, like, for example, Avito, where you can sell, people can sell to each other stuff. The company worth, it's not public, but it's worth around $2.6 billion. We have Telegram, created by Russian businessmen. And I have a question to audience. Speaking of media, because I'm a journalist and I'm going to the direction I'm expert in, could you raise your hands? How many of you use Telegram for chatting or connecting with your friends? Not that many. And how many of you use Telegram as a source of your daily news? Just a couple of hands, but less. Yesterday we heard from Samir Saran that for some people in India, WhatsApp is kind of, morning newspaper. So in Russia, the Telegram became for kind of the same, because in the media sphere, then the TV companies owned by the government or by the people who close to the government. We have issues with getting the information, objective information, or not only the state formal opinion about what's going on in the world. So Telegram now is the thing, and I'm just tell you what's going on. There are plenty of channels. People create channels, anonymous channels, where you can read insights, where you can read things about corruption or luxury villas belongs to Russian officials somewhere in the nice place in south of France, and so on and so forth. And since most of the channels, many of them belong to famous people or to journalists or to even the ministers, but many of the channels, and the most interesting channels, they anonymous, and what we have in the media. For example, you can read in their channel that their governor of the region, or according to some sources, will step down tomorrow. And then the classic media, who have the license as a media, they start citing and writing about it, and they got a huge audience, but they citing this source in this Telegram channel. So even the anonymous channels or people who run them, they give interviews to the magazine, to newspapers, and even they take part in their conferences. So actually, there are a lot to say what's going on in the sphere of the media, because digitalization changing how society, how people communicate with authorities, and how authorities communicate with the people. And I have some interesting examples about that, but my time is ending, so maybe I will tell a bit later during the discussion.
Excellent. Thanks, Tatiana. On to Ilona now. Interestingly, Ilona and I were having a chat just before the panel was about to start. Russia is one of the few countries in the world that has actively supported the right to be forgotten. Now, for reasons that are clearly beyond to me, but for an interesting hypothesis that Ilona has, I don't know whether she will share it with you, but there is a whole host of legislative activity that is happening on Russia's digital sector and digital activity that mirrors many of the debates that happen in the rest of the world, and hopefully Ilona will touch upon some of them. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation, for being here. So I represent the academic stakeholders. So and I would like to talk about some history. So going back to 90s, the end of 90s and the 2000s, when the internet has got this widespread in Russia. Everybody is hearing about this acute trend of internet fragmentation, and Russia and all other BRICS countries are kind of a flagship in this process. So we are accused of this bad activity of fragmenting internets on the local national sovereign internets, like in the plural number. But I must deliver some kind of history how it started in Russia, and that's why I believe that this fragmentation and localization of internet inside the national borders is not possible for us, hopefully. So it will be surprising to some of you, but the state has no hand in internet development in Russia at the beginning. So basically it was on the shoulders of public organizations, of research organizations, that was connected to communications and telecom. And personally, I witnessed this emergence of internet in Russia. When I was growing up, it was my school time. I was living in a small, closed at the time settlement that was a home to Russian army officers on duty. And I witnessed the process when the internet emerged in our settlements. So primarily it was a local network between the personal computers in the households for those people who have them. And it's very interesting how the network was used at that time. So it was kind of sharing the audio files, sharing the video, sharing the films, or even playing some games on the network connection. But then we have it's two internet service providers with the access to the global internet. And the status of our settlement changed, it became open, and things were growing up. And I must say that this story is kind of similar in all other small cities around our huge country. So if you will look not only at Moscow, at Saint Petersburg, or other big cities that have millions of populations, the development of internet in other areas were kind of grassroots. And that's why we have a bunch of service providers that have this trans-border internet exchange points. You know, you've been hearing much about the plans of Russian government to kind of implement the Chinese model of the Great Firewall in Russia. And the talks are still going in the State Duma, in the government, that they are trying to discuss how to implement them. But the fact is that now we have about 2,000 of internet exchange points with a broad connection. And when it comes to politics and technology, the latter wins, because, you know, it's very different. It's very difficult to rebuild the whole system, the whole network that was built in Russia in terms of internet access to the global network. Yeah, it's pretty costly and it's pretty useless. So that's why I'm still believing that these plans of the government to localize our internet will be buried down at the table. Okay?
Thank you. Oleg, over to you.
Thank you, Arun. I think I will close our opening remarks with the discussion of how government and how government is trying to get used to internet, to digital technologies. So as Tatiana already mentioned, we have this new national program which is called Digital Economy, and the idea is that this program will be financed both by the government and by the private sector. But there are some other instances of interaction between government on the one hand and society and the industry on the other hand, and I want to just highlight several cases for you to understand what is happening in Russia. So one of the big stories of past couple of years is the in Russian it's called so charges for likes, for reports. So we have a criminal law article that is designed to punish people for extremist and hate speech views. But over a couple of past years, it has been increasingly used for punishing people who repost something or say something on their social media. And it became very scandalous because sometimes these cases are not very extreme. So you can see a person like yourself who shared some sarcastic image, and then he is summoned to the court. So there was a big pushback from the society, and there was some, for example, one of my favorite artists, she wrote an ironic song about it. Some people campaigned against it, but not only from the society, the parliament also initiated some process, and just yesterday it was announced that there is now a move to soften the language of this criminal article, so that people will not be punished for reposts of some jokes, and that the article will remain in place for real extremism. And there are local NGOs who campaign and who kind of monitor this situation. So another case, again, Tatiana mentioned Telegram. Telegram is very popular in Russia, and maybe this is one of the reasons why our authorities tried to block it in April. And this is a very interesting case, because blocking Telegram was a very ambitious goal, but several months later we see that the government was either unwilling or unable to completely block it. So there were several steps initiated to block Telegram because it did not provide information in accordance with Russian legislation that could help fight terrorism and extremism online. But what we saw over these months is that the audience of Telegram in Russia did not significantly decrease, and moreover, some Russian officials who used to use Telegram for their professional or private goals, they still use it. So this speaks about the language of the law, which did not prohibit users from using Telegram, but also from the complexity of this task. So now it's still active, and this is one of the instances where the government has to think about maybe smarter regulation. And I know this happens in all other countries as well, but this is the case for Russia. And so my last case is about a different kind of interaction where the ministries that I'm most interested in, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is in different ways engaged online. So Russia has over past years scored very high on the digital diplomacy ranking, because we have a designated team in the foreign ministry and in our embassies who work online to kind of reach out to countries where they work in and to populations abroad, mostly in English, but increasingly in French and Arabic and other languages. But on the other hand, the ministry is also involved in negotiations with countries around the world, and we have this pattern of agreements on information security or agreements on security in the use of ICT. So I can elaborate on that, but so far, this is it. Thank you.
Thanks, Oleg. So now we have roughly 15-20 minutes where we can ask questions to the panelists on anything that they have spoken about, but also things that you might want them to feel. So please feel free to line up on both sides, and we'll get a few questions in. But Viktoriia, I had something to ask regarding the high percentage of Russians on LinkedIn that you mentioned. So the first is, what are the kinds of jobs that Russians are applying for on the internet? And the second is, you have these, job portals, as they are called in India as well, monster.com, Naukri, which means jobs.com. But the perception is that even if these portals are useful for securing access to economic opportunities or jobs that you could not otherwise have had, when people sit down face to face with their employer, there are a whole host of other factors that come into play. For instance, in India, caste is a big thing. So there are certain factors that remain relevant centuries later, and to the extent that these web portals have been able to offer access to economic opportunities, they have only given you a first step, a push, if you will. So what are the kinds of opportunities that Russians are seeking on the internet vis-a-vis, finding jobs? And are they really successful? When somebody meets a prospective employer on LinkedIn or some other portal, what is the process like, and where does it end?
Thank you for the question. Well, first of all, I have to mention that LinkedIn is blocked in Russia, by the way, if you didn't know. Yeah, there were some problems with the portal, and it did not provide to Russian government some important information. Now Russians, they use LinkedIn, but most of all they use when they are abroad. It's something like to stay connected to the other part of world. We have other services, most Russian in Russian, like Headhunter or some other super job. It's like a service when you can look if some known or unknown for you companies have some vacancies. You can apply, you can send your resume, but generally it's not a guarantee that you will get the job. It's like an initial step. And personally, I also have experience in using that, and very often employers do not even react, unfortunately, to your CV. So you have to be very active. You have to use the emails, you have to use some networks, and some of Russian companies, they do not announce, for example, that they have vacancies, and you can just send your CV and be lucky, for example. It also happens. So I think it depends on people, and of course it gets more and more popular to use such services, and they become more, they become updated, they become more convenient and useful. But I think that there is space to improve.
Thank you. I think there's a question there, so let's take that and then come back.
Thanks for the panel. My name is Arindraji. I work for a research organization down in Bangalore. So my question is more on the extra. I know some of the panelists do work on digital diplomacy, and so my question is basically on how Russia sees the sort of global efforts on the norms formulation process, and more specifically how Russia views the application of international law. Because as far back as 1998, Russia proposed the first treaty that could potentially have regulated cyberspace and sort of had created a hierarchical regime in that sense. But now with the sort of norms formulation and a bit of process and a bit of flux, how does Russia see these global efforts, and what is the Russian foreign ministry planning, in what capacity are they planning to intervene?
So who wants to take this? Ilona? Yeah.
I can start with this. Thank you for the question. Well, Russia has been engaged in this cyber regulation quite a long time, since 1998, when they first proposed this UN resolution and established this group of governmental experts under the UN auspice. But, you know, the last group collapsed without a consensus report, but Russia is still trying to revive it in this format. And I know that people who are responsible for these issues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as well, they are trying to find new supporters for the new draft of convention, of the UN Convention of the Code of Conduct for States in the Cyberspace. And I know that the opening of the 73rd UN Assembly, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs raised this question also, and he said that we reiterate our commitment to promote this Code of Conduct, and the work will be still prepared in the first committee of the United Nations for the disarmament. Also, last year, our government distributed the draft convention on prevention of cybercrime. In Russian version, it sounds like prevention of information security crime. So the draft was circulated last year, and I think we are in the process of collecting some feedback on the proposal. So basically, it's another way for combating cybercrime, in the opposite to the Budapest Convention that is still in force, and a lot of European countries are in for this. Also, Russia is also engaged in the OSCE process of cyber norms, and last year we have proposed this cyber plan to kind of steer the process to make it like more enforceable, because they have the OSCE issued this pack of cyber norms, but they are still kind of consultative, still kind of so you can be willing to follow them or you cannot be, but so there is work to enforce it.
Thank you. There's another question.
Hi, my name is Nikhil Pawar. I run a publication called Media Nama. Two quick questions. Number one is
Nikhil,
that,
can you be a little louder?
So the first question is that in case of Telegram, are there instances of misinformation, and in that context, is Telegram in Russia held liable for the content being sent in groups? Second question is that India's reached the glorious target of having over 100 internet shutdowns this year alone. Do you have internet shutdowns in Russia? If not, how does the government deal with misinformation on the social platforms?
Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I will take the first. So it's tricky one. So there have been instances of misinformation spread on Telegram, and even in some cases, Russian officials who got this information, maybe not directly from Telegram, but from, let's say, from Twitter. Someone on Twitter cited something from Telegram, and Russian officials said something that was not true, and then had to take back the statement. So Pavel Durov, who is the founder of Telegram, he has a very complicated history of relations with the Russian government. And this fall, Telegram changed the privacy policy, and they introduced a provision that allows for sharing of users' IP address and users' phone number in case there is a court decision that this user was involved in terrorist activity. But this is the privacy policy. But then on his Telegram channel, Durov specified that this provision will not apply to Russia because he has basically no trust in Russian authorities. But there are different ways. For example, there are several fact-checking groups on Telegram who fact-checked statements in other popular channels, and they say, look, this is not correct. And they kind of try to name and shame or spread awareness of the fact that you should not, you should be at least skeptical of the anonymous channels.
Anything about the question on internet shutdowns? So in India, you have these very unique phenomena called internet shutdowns, where localized parts of the internet they just go dark in the event the authorities feel that there is sometimes a natural or a man-made emergency in the form of a terrorist attack, a riot, or even so the application of these bans on the internet have been politically colored. I think that's the point that Nikhil too was trying to make. Have there been any such instances in Russia of parts of the internet being shut down?
So I don't recall actually whether this has happened, but there is this issue is always discussed. On the one hand, the information networks is considered part of Russian critical infrastructure. On the other hand, there is always probably a suspicion that in case of some protests or some emergency situation, this can happen for deliberately or by accident. So I don't have an answer. But I just wanted to say that this has been discussed by some people in Russia.
Great. I think there's a question here as well.
Thank you. My name is Amina Khairi. I'm a journalist from Egypt. I just have a question because there's no other way for us to get the feedback of Russian citizens, average citizens, regarding what is being said about the intervention, Russian intervention in the American presidential elections. I just want to know how is the feedback or the reaction of the ordinary people in Russia regarding that? Do they view this as like a victory or something positive that has been done on behalf of the Russian political system? Because in other countries of the world, by the way, not all countries view this as something negative. Some countries or some people view this as something, that says that the Russian system has been extremely clever in doing this.
Right.
Thank
so
you.
what do Russians think of the claim that Russians elected Donald Trump? I'm going to make
Can I start first?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, sorry. So I have a personal story about this because right before the elections, like in September or October, I wrote an op-ed for foreign. I tried to publish it in Foreign Policy, but they declined it. But it was about how the idea that Russia is rooting for Trump is misleading. And so my personal impression is that most people did not care about who will be the president, and in general, people are very sarcastic about Russia being able to elect president somewhere else. There was a recent poll by Pew, I guess, and it found that the majority of Russians did not believe that Russia had any significant role in the elections. But I just wanted to say that maybe on the societal level there are a lot of jokes. One of my favorite jokes is that we have a tendency in Russia to blame a lot of things on the Americans. And so if you in your apartment building, if your stairway is dirty, then Obama used to be blamed for that. And so the joke was that when Trump got elected, that Obama passed him this nuclear case and the keys to Russian apartment buildings. Okay. Again, this is not how the elite thinks about it, maybe, but on the very basic level, this is just a source for a lot of jokes.
Thanks, Oleg. Tatiana, can I bring you in on that question?
And I would add that when you're asking what Russian thinks about something, you need to know where Russians get information and news. So according to polls, 73% get the news from TV, around 37% from internet magazine or something, and the social media 28%. So the majority of Russians get their news from TV, and you can imagine what kind of position they get, official position. So only the certain age group, 18-24, don't use TV as the main source of the news. So, and if you compare, for example, some surveys and polls about what Russians think about America, you can really correlate when you have a different agenda on TV. It can, go ups and down. Oh, America is our main threat, and Americans negatively, have a negative attitude to Russia. And then something goes differently on the main media, and people change their mind, and you can see this on their servers.
So just like India, basically.
Yeah.
Victoria.
I also would like to add, but to answer if Russians perceive Trump as a victory, by the way. There is a recent research by American Pew Research poll, and as it showed, after the election of Trump, Russians accepted his victory in presidential election very positively. It was like, I guess, 64, 65 of Russians who accepted Trump very positively. And just after 1 year, it's decreased to 24, 25 of Russians who support Trump. And now people really look disappointed by everything that's going on. So I do not think that Russians would regard it as a victory, even if they believe that it could be some interference.
Right. I think there's a question there. Beta.
Thank you, Chair, and very insightful panel. My question is about the social media health in Russia. Those of us who follow American politics on Twitter often encounter, a Twitter account by, for instance, an Alison Smith, whose bio is in Cyrillic. And there have also been reports about the factory of trolls that are often directed at external politics. My question is, does social media engagement in Russia also encounter trolls, perhaps state-sponsored trolls and so on?
Who wants to take this?
Well, I just, in general, I didn't follow domestic situation, but in general, when there are elections, like in other states, Russian politicians, they've seen that there is a power in using social media to push their cause and to attract people around them. So of course it is used, and there are sometimes claims that some people are paid to go to comment section and write some specific comments. But on the other hand, there is a more like civic use of social media for not maybe purely political action, but for some social urban campaigns. So small leaders who are not necessarily political leaders, they try to organize communities. For example, in my city, the situation with public transportation is getting worse, and one guy who is not trying to become a governor, but I think he's an architect or something like that. So he's trying to get people around his cause and say that we can make our local government more accountable for how they spend money on the development of the city. And so they use social media, and they use different mapping services intensively for that goal.
Ilona, do you want to? Ilona and then.
I would like to share some personal observation regarding the local internet. Yeah, this phenomena actually exists because when you are looking at Vkontakte social network, a lot of our mass media newspapers have channels there. They duplicate the news, and sometimes they open the comments, and it is a very it's very common to see very strange accounts that are really angry with something, and they are just pushing their agenda and even fighting with ordinary users of the social media. And you can really recognize that something is wrong with this person, and probably it's not like his own views, but something that he or she should translate to the conversation and to light up some kind of fight between people.
Ilona, I just want to ask you at this point, is there a generic name for that kind of character on the internet? Because there is in India. I don't want to get into that now, but is there a particular name for this anonymous character who's always angry on the internet?
We have a bunch of them, actually, because there are different age categories.
I see. Please
You
tell
have
us about it.
angry pupils. You have how you call it? I don't know whether people will understand me, but the people who are really have their minds back in the USSR. So something like this. And also another example is that maybe some of them know the famous our opposition politician Alexei Navalny. And he has a very huge presence online, especially in the YouTube. And another kind of this activity of trolls is that they are trying to shut down his videos or his programs that are running on his channel by a huge amount of dislikes on the videos. So when they start this kind of live streaming, live programs, even his coordinators are pointing out that, so look, in 5 minutes we will have 1,000 of dislikes, like a bunch of them. So it's really kind of a strategy of trolls to put this down.
Great. Tatiana, before I get to you, is there a question? Yeah, the gentleman at the back. Can you speak into the mic, please? No.
My name is Shubham Sagar from QTT Media Works. My question is, Russian bots are known concern over website. Are they also a threat within Russia? Are there any plans by Russian government to counter these bots?
So Tatiana, since our time is also up, I will let you have the last word on this. Of course, in response to the question about misinformation, also on the question of bots.
Yeah, but just maybe somebody wants to take this question, because I would like to bring some information about social media use,
please.
if you don't mind. I just think that Ilona mentioned Navalny, one of the opposition leader, and the dramatic shift, I think, happened years ago when there were huge protests, and suddenly authorities realized that Navalny organized protests with a lot of students and just youth and people from the schools, and they realized they missed this group of their population, because these people, they don't watch TV, they get information from the internet mostly and social media, and they don't have this official agenda in their heads, and the authorities actively work with all the YouTube bloggers, Instagram bloggers, even the blogger from YouTube were invited to parliament to speak up. And speaking of elections, for example, a time ago you could see in the Instagram pages of actresses, designers, even the heroes of the reality shows, but the main thing, they have a lot of followers, like millions. Kind of they post the same themes, like everything is good, can you notice how life is getting better and better in our country, in our city. So it was very obvious that the authorities start to work with that.
Right.
And I don't know if I have 1 minute more to bring an interesting example, because after this realization that the youth don't have a lack of this official information in their mind, and after several movies, Navalny was made about one of the richest men in the country, Mr. Usmanov, who's a billionaire, and about the head of Russian National Guard, accusing them in corruption, of all the schemes and, you know, elite real estate. Both of them made a video blog in response. For Russia, it's something, you know, unbelievable, because people of certain level, they pretend not hear this kind of accusations. They, maybe the PR company or the company go to the court and mostly they win. Don't ask me why. Mostly they win. But personally sit in front of the camera and saying like, you blame me and this is not true, this is unbelievable. And this has happened because authorities kind of understand they need to speak with the youth. So this is, I guess, an interesting shift to notice in Russia, speaking of media and communication.
Great. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I wish we could go on, but alas, we can't. But please join me in applauding the panelists for their really insightful take on what it means to be online in Russia. Now, I think we'll have a very short